somehow what they reply will be sent to the taxman, so they'll end up paying more tax. But so it's a question of, it comes under the same issue of creating trust. So you saw the picture on the ground. What happened in Greece is that very, very quickly, Greece was part of the share sample right from the very first wave, when there was only 1 in 12 countries. It was the first time that they ever used laptops in the survey, and so it was able to deliver in 2004. That's the plus side. The second side is that at the time when all the attention of the world was turned to Greece, that was the time of the Greek financial crisis, 2010 to 2014 was the height of the crisis. So the attention of the world was turned to Greece, especially on the things that share was supposed to be focusing. So incomes of older people and pensions, and health and healthcare. So the researchers all through the world were very anxious to see the Greek data, because it was the first time you had big and permanent drops in income in an OECD country. Nevertheless, through dysfunctions that I will go on about, we managed. It was the only country that missed 2 data at the height of the financial crisis, and the most important and interesting day. So Greece dropped out of share in 2011 and 2013, and then we got back in again in 2015, and luckily we were able to find the original sample. So it still is the only true panel data set, and is one of the very few interdisciplinary surveys. So Greece is ex ante. I mean, Greece should be a country that has a high need for share-like survey. Why? Because it's aging very fast. It's been known this since 1980. Only Italy has the worst dependency ratio than Greece. The fertility rate has been under 1.4 since 1980, has never risen above 1.4. And the need for paying for pensions was the reason why the country became essentially bankrupt in 2010. So that's one factor. And then we have, in the past, very rapid structural change, which means that the new generations, the new people entering old age, are very different from the predecessors. So stereotypes are something to be fought against. Why? Because there was very rapid rural-urban migration from between 1950 to 1980, very much like in Egypt. So the Greek cities doubled or trebled in size in the 70s and 80s, and older people, the typical older person in Greece now was born in a village and very frequently still has links with the village. So and sometimes also this translates to cultural differences as well. Also, we have high rates of intergenerational exchanges, cohabitation, education, familiar welfare, all those things which are very important for social policy and economic policy, but because they happen inside the family and the household, are essentially unknown. So you need a survey to write them down. It's an interesting test case on an international scale, this drop of incomes that I mentioned. And at the same time was a pension system which was incredibly generous. In certain parts, it was incredibly generous in some parts of the system and incredibly stingy and poor in others. And then finally, the administrative data that existed was very bad indeed, because for example, there was over 200 pension providers, and which were counting the number of pensions that were giving up, but not pensioners. So someone receiving 2 pensions, there were a lot of them, counted as 2 people. So there was no personal identifier to link administrative data with each other. So as a result, the real conditions of the older people were essentially unknown. So we should have leapt at the opportunity of having share. However, to be absolutely frank, the way that it developed over time, and we're talking about 15 years now, was disappointing compared to what it should have been. So, for example, counting the number of users that are registered in Greece, there were only 90 in 2019. That's half the number in Portugal. Portugal has the same population, has fewer units, more waves than Portugal, but it seems to have given rise to some with very little interest. Low take-up of researchers, despite this demand at universities for master's thesis in statistics or epidemiology or sociology, etc. There is readily available data which appears not to be used. And many academic researchers prefer to collect new data of their own rather than use the data which is already existing and sitting there. And finally, policymakers in the pension institutes, the health sector, the government, they have seldom, if ever, used shared data, even where other data were not available. For example, share is the only data set which links financial situation with health status, because the data that's collected by the health system just has health data, and the Ministry of Finance just has financial data. There's nothing that connects the two except a survey such as share. But despite the fact that the data is there, it's not really used. In the last 2 or 3 years, some international organizations such as the World Bank have begun using share, but it's happening rather reluctantly. So why is this? So just taking a step back and thinking about the different kinds of data. So administrative data, which is the usual data that governments deal with, that's produced as a byproduct of the process of governing a country. So in their nature, they're produced by centralized body. So because they're produced by organizations which deliver services, they reflect the existing legal categories and also reflect the current priorities of the administration. Conceptually, they refer to the totality. They're not a sample. Conceptually, they refer to the total population, the population being served, and this is they deal. I mean, it's actually, this is reflected in the name. The name statistics. It was first used in German, but it is to do with the information to do with the state. So the word statistics come from the word state. The two things are very closely linked. Now, survey data have a different provenance. I mean, well, the first centralized state, in fact, was ancient Egypt. Okay, the ancient Egyptians were the people who invented geometry. They invented a lot of record keeping, etc. So, in a way, the great granddaddy of statistics. Now, in more decentralized systems, their survey data is much more common. They result from an attempt to describe a reality which is outside the control of the researcher. So you need first to define something and then find the right questions to approach it, which is a question of decentralization. So survey data was very frequently developed in federal states, such as the United States, where the central power needed to monitor what was happening. The federal government in the United States needs to monitor what was happening, but the decision-making power very frequently was further down in the states. So in order for the federal government to be able to do its job, it needed to have an idea what was happening on the ground. And to do that, survey technique. The United States is the country that has the richest and the greatest variety of sample surveys, and which often exist at the federal level to monitor decision-making further down, whether at state, county, or even further down. Now, surveys were also used as international governance and international cooperation proceeded after in the 20th century. Surveys was one way of having an overall global picture. Tried to standardize labor statistics, and they had something like spread of Keynesian macroeconomics after the Second World War meant that a number of surveys, such as household expenditure survey and the various surveys which feed into national accounts, were standardized and controlled by the UN. So in order the survey data, administrative data exists in any case. I mean, it's just a byproduct. Survey data has to actually be initiated to be produced, and also it requires a separate organization and a separate budget. And typically, whereas you have individual researchers who conduct surveys of their own, regular surveys that are conducted over a period of time, and they also capture an element of time, they needed some centralized institution either to finance them or use them, because otherwise individual researchers would just produce surveys which at a point in time which are not linked one to the other. Now, the EU, the European Union, is a special kind of, it's not a federal state, it's not even a confederal state, but it is a body which is trying to promote cooperation between sovereign states. So typically the European Union as a body can actually pass laws, directives they call it, in a very narrow body of matters to do with what was used to be called the common market, the free movement of goods, services, and people. So they can decide, for example, they can legislate on things like tariffs, on things like labor movements, and there they pass a law which is applied throughout the countries. But in all others aspects of economics, social policy, it has an ambition to say something, but it doesn't have the authority. It doesn't have the legal authority to enforce something. So what is happening in the EU is the EU governments get together in the European Council. They at least once every 6 months, and they agree on objectives. We will decide, for example, that we will tackle climate change, or we will do something meaningful about aging. And so the European Union, at the level of the Common Declaration, objective, but how to proceed this objective is up to the independent member states, independent sovereign governments, and one government cannot intervene inside another government and tell it how to do its job. However, they all get together and they say, we will tackle unemployment, or we will tackle climate change, or whatever. So the question is, is there a way in which this can be something more just as an expression of wish, just a wish list? And the way the European Union has come up with this is a thing called soft law. Hard law is when you pass directives. Is the first you pass a law, and then you everyone is obliged to follow it. In areas such as in the social field, health, and economics, what they've come up is what is called the open method of coordination. The open method of coordination builds on political will, that you have sovereign governments who get together and say, yes, we do want to tackle such a thing, but it essentially what it tries to do is try to commit them to do specific things and to measure their progress according to external benchmarks. The question is, if it's a wish list, you just say, well, we tackle poverty, and then everybody does what they wanted. They just say, well, look how many things we do. The usual thing that governments fill their press releases with. Now, the question is, the open method of coordination tries to get governments to agree on specific quantitative objectives to do with targets. And they're defined in terms of outcomes, not effort that we'll try to do something, but we will try to achieve specific results, quantitative results. Now, in order to have quantitative results, what you need, of course, is to have an external way of measuring progress, which is outside the control of the governments, and which is almost a definition of the surveys. So if you, for things such as the open method of coordination to succeed, you need to have a harmonized survey, which exists across all the member states, which has common definitions on which you can define indicators, and then on the basis of these indicators, you can define targets. For example, poverty, you have to decide. The poverty statistics in Europe are derived from the Survey of Income and Living Conditions, EU SILC. There is a methodology of defining poverty, 60% of median income, and the poverty line is the number of people below that, below 60% of median income as measured in the EU SILC survey. So the necessity of governing and coordinating 27 governments in the EU creates the need, the demand for the existence of a number of surveys on which can be used to compare and benchmark one country against the other. So you can say, well, how is Greece doing relative to Spain? Why is Spain doing better than Portugal, for example? And there's a number of European surveys, the European Survey of Income and Living Conditions, which covers income and is used in social policy, the Labor Force Survey, which is used in unemployment. And recently, and this is important, is SHARE started as a purely academic survey, which was in a subset of countries, not all of which were members of the European Union. Switzerland was there in the start, and it's not in the European Union. But since 2017, SHARE has become a European infrastructure in the sense that it has data, it produces data for all member states, and hence it can now feed into this process of the open method of coordination. So that brings me to the question of in a survey, the demand, the use, and the supply, the production of data. So at the planning phase, which is the phase that you are currently at in Egypt, is whether to decide to go into the field. Before going into the field, there you have to balance the need for the survey, the benefits, versus the problem of the implementation, which is the supply and the cost, feasibility. And the perceived need is what will determine whether and by whom the survey will be financed, while the supply side will decide what kind of survey, feasibility may rule it out, etc. And very frequently, feasibility issues at the stage of when deciding whether to go ahead or not, they operate in the sense of canceling out all other considerations, trump cards, not as in Trump, the president, as Trump as in the game of cards. So it's one game, one card that cancels out all the others that you have. So it's very easy to say something cannot be done, and because then you just rule out all other aspects. And very frequently, it's the key to surveys, and the key to, I think, the Egyptian survey at this stage is to demonstrate that things can be done, that something is feasible, and is feasible at an acceptable quality, level of quality. There, it's important to have to appeal to international practice. You can say, well, you can find solutions that have been tried elsewhere, and of course, the point about a pilot is to demonstrate that something can be done. So once the survey exists, then there's a question of the utilization. So and then we can borrow an idea from energy economics. So you have the data, and you have activities upstream of the data. So which is all the activities needed to produce the data and get the data to the user. So it will be all the questionnaire, the sampling, questioning the fields, cleaning of the data, imputations, etc. All the activity needed to get it to the user. And then you have the downstream attitudes. How is the data to be used? Who are the users? And what do they do with them? And then you have different kinds of users who have different kinds of demands and different priorities. You have domestic versus international users. We mentioned quite a lot of tension. For example, the international users of share give emphasis on the panel data, panel nature of the survey, because they need this idea of the continued data, whereas a researcher within a particular country wants to have as good a picture of his or her own country as possible, which, for example, could mean different things in terms of decisions about what to invest in what type of sample, etc. So share in Greece, I mean, had a problem. Well, I was involved in aging economics, and at the time, actually, I was an advisor to the then Prime Minister of Greece, and I talked to the National Statistical Service of Greece. At the time, there was something like a monopoly producers of statistics. And they were categorical that something like share would not be feasible. This is what Vicky said earlier, that at the time in 2004, when the first wave took place, everyone was fully occupied with the Athens Olympics. And they said, well, it's impossible to run something now. Maybe we can do it by 2006. And of course, this is equivalent to saying that you can't participate. And however, we persisted and overcame the sort of difficulties that Vicky mentioned. And in the end, we were able, this first step, to show that those obstacles could be overcome. For example, one issue that we did overcome, that there was no population frame. So we had to build the survey, the survey frame out of telephone numbers, which meant that they had to go through two filters. One, to take out the business info, the business numbers. 2004, luckily, there were no mobile telephone, or mobile telephones were far fewer than they are now. So they were able to build the sample on landlines. They had to net out the business telephone numbers, and then had to find out of the remaining phone numbers which contained individuals over 50 or not. This was used for the first three waves. From wave 4 on, we moved to an area-based sample because in the meantime, the statistical service was able to supply with sort of the sampling results in a number of blocks, urban blocks, and all households in each block are questioned to see which are eligible, which contain people over 50 or not. Well, we can talk about this for a very long time. However, it was demonstrated that despite the problems, and there was some grumbling about quality, etc., but the Greek data was delivered, and the point, and it had, in terms of in terms of other data, it had some positive features. So one of the positive features in Greece is that because households don't move quite so frequently, there's close links between households and neighbors, etc. It's very easy to follow people up. So it's easy in Greece to come up with to produce a panel survey. The retention ratio of people retaining in the panel is over 85%, whereas in places like Germany, it's much lower. Also, older Greeks are very keen to talk. As I mentioned, they're very keen to talk about their families, their health, etc. So the participation rate was pretty high, certainly high compared to other countries. So on the supply side, things were going smoothly, and then it was interrupted when funding shifted from from a purely research project funded by the European Commission, the DG Research, the Directorate General for Research, because SHARE was considered to have proven itself, was shifted, at least partly, the responsibility for paying for data collection was shifted to the national governments. So, and that's when, in this transfer phase, Greece was not able to participate in the survey in 2011 and 2013. The interesting thing is that it wasn't because the money for this, despite the fact that it's supposed to be in the middle of a financial crisis, the money for the survey was there. The problem was trying to get the bureaucratic steps in order to be able to meet the deadlines. And the problem was that in the midst of a financial crisis, people's minds were elsewhere, so they didn't want to. They had no time to devote to despite from co-funding from the United States. So the United States, because Greece was such an interesting case at the time because of the financial crisis, they were willing to contribute $140,000 to cover the cost of the Greek data collection, but we were not able to deliver because the various ministries couldn't get their act together. And finally, this happened, which was as the country team was extremely frustrating. The country team exists independently of ministries, and we are a bunch of academics. Essentially, we're doing it because we are interested in aging, because we had to do all the work to participate. We had to do all the translations and participate at least in the initial phases of training, etc., in order to be able to participate. Because it was always talking on the phone, that there were also wasn't ruled out that you're not doing the survey. It was just that we were trying to keep up to deadlines, and we finally missed them. Anyway, we were able to come back in 2015. Why? Because Greece, again, being such an interesting country in the European sense, we got a lot of money from the European Commission, which paid for the whole for an increased sample size, an enlarged sample size in 2015, the sixth wave. The Greek state finally decided to cough up, and we got the first sort of sizable chunk of money 2 years ago. So we're not there yet, but it's a learning process, and the politicians, they have to be taught. What part of the problem? Problem is that the responsibility for share lies in the research ministry, whereas the users of shares, so the sort of ministries who would actually make use of the information that share would produce, the health ministry, social policy, and economics, are elsewhere. So the various bits didn't talk to each other. Anyway, an example of why a share is useful. Greece, in the case of pensions and pensioners, Greece has a very fragmented pension system, as used to have. That's one of the reasons why it bankrupted itself. So I can easily produce an example where a single person, a woman, and especially because women, in addition to their own pension, could collect widows' pensions. One woman could collect 12 different pensions, which is fine. Okay, I mean, she paid for them, but she would count in the statistics, in the administrative statistics, as 12 separate poor pensioners. So you have one person who's basically swimming in money because she's getting 12 pensions, but in the data, she's covered as 12 very poor pensioners. So there was no personal identifier, so there was no way of linking at the time. There was no way of linking the different. You knew that there was this problem of multiple pensions. You could tell it at the macro level because the number of pensions was higher than the number of people in the relevant age groups of the population, but you couldn't tell who was who. So so despite the fact that it was an area of critical importance, both in social policy, the example of the 12 supposedly very poor people who are one a very rich person is one, but at the same time it was also important in the fiscal sense that the state was giving 10% of GDP of the gross domestic product as direct grants to the pension system. This was the reason it went bankrupt. So despite the fact that there was a crying need for a survey that would be able to produce levels that and would answer what is the financial situation of particular people, not checks. And despite the fact that social policy was literally blind, it was never used. I mean, as a pension expert and aging expert, I devoted a lot of time, personal time, and to help produce share, but I was very disappointed that it was hardly ever used by decision makers. So why was this insufficient take-up? There's the problems of demand for data. The first is that the state doesn't work with indicators. What is known as evidence-based governance was something that was very foreign to Greek, to the Greek public administration. All governments are learning the hard way through looking at pandemic indicators, etc., to work on the basis of indicators, and they're getting used to measuring themselves against quantitative targets in the pandemic. But of course, the traditional way that ministries worked in Greece were essentially that they saw data as a part of public relations. So saying the achievements of the current minister. So if the things weren't going too well, they just made sure that it wasn't published. And similarly, the research structures would limit themselves to very narrow objects, and what they're doing, trying to do secure extra finance for themselves, and extra finance for themselves typically meant financing new data source, even when existing data existed. So secondly, the government, they always traditionally they saw statistics as a compulsion which limits the degrees of freedom, and in an ideal situation, Greek governments would prefer to control all data. We shouldn't forget that Greece is the country, in addition to the Parthenon and all these ancient guys, there's also the country known as for Greek statistics. Greek statistics was one of the reasons why we went bankrupt, and it was the Greek Ministry of Finance estimated the government deficit as 3% in 2009, and in the end it turned out that it was actually 15%. So, but they managed to make sure that the data they presented was that which confirmed the 3%, whereas in reality it was 15%. So independent data, when you have somebody who's trying to lie in such a big way, is, you're on a losing wicket. So also hostile to independent scientific research, the government ministers hardly ever bother to look at research findings, and an overwhelming interest in the narrow reform issues coming up. So it's what to reform the pension problem. The pension problem was something that was always came up. So the third type of users was universities. Universities and academics are focused on publications for themselves. So they don't really indulge in any social dialogue. They reckon that if they indulge in social dialogue on local issues, they only have to lose. And it's easier if you want to publish things in economics and in the social sciences. It was very hard to, before 2010, to publish anything on Greece because it was considered always a special case. So universities, they did not rise to the challenge. Research policy was limited to attracting funds, as I mentioned, and society outside this sort of academic field was complacent. There were little discussion on the social issues raised by aging. If there was any discussion, it was all taken up almost exclusively by pensions. And I'm talking as a pension expert myself. Pensions is a subject which is very easy to know what you need to do in the case of aging. I mean, it's what is known as a no-brainer. If you have many more pensioners than contributors, it's not a good idea to give 12 pensions to the same person and then not counting them. Or another way is to give Greek hairdressers the right to get a pension at the age of 50, or I know that a number of issues which are also common in the Arab world, and life pensions to daughters of civil servants for all their lives, etc. Anyway, the point is that even when people were talking about active aging, that was not sufficient to overcome widespread ageism, and the questions that arise in the context of an aging society were considered rather difficult issues, best avoided. So there was no demand from society about, there's no question about how would Greek society adapt to aging, despite the fact that it's the second fastest aging country in Europe. So, which would probably mean something like third in the world. So if you have Japan at the top, then you have Italy, and then you have Greece. But unfortunately, the Greeks were not very happy to talk about the issue. It's easier to pretend that the question didn't exist. So, I mean, those are the question of supply. There were also problems in the supply and the production of data. So if you put in the production of data, the upstream part is essentially what's the free rider problem. The free rider problem, from the point of view of a researcher, is much easier to use the data and to criticize rather than produce data for others. So there's very little take up or help to produce data. And it's also easier to criticize data exists, and in order and to try to secure funds for new survey instruments, which could duplicate what there was. And the financing, which was what actually we devote a lot of our time is that there's the funders, the possible funders, display very little scientific curiosity. They don't. They would like to spend surveys on things that produce good PR sheets rather than answering gaps in knowledge. Now, there are also a number of downstream issues which are to do with how are the data used, because and this would affect you in Egypt as users of data. There's a question. Interdisciplinary data is very hard to use because it requires a ready-made forum where people from different disciplines meet and discuss. So typically, the users of such data are concentrated or in institutes of aging. There's a National Institute of Aging in the United States. There's 33 centers to do with aging in the UK. There's hundreds worldwide. There's a list there, because a dedicated institute actually comes to grips with the problem as the interdisciplinary problem as they appear in the case of aging. And this is the best way of overcoming the problem of the academic silos. Each academic discipline is happier with its own data and happier talking to people from the same field. They don't. It's harder to deal with interdisciplinary information than to use data which already comes from your same from your same discipline, and essentially it's much easier to publish stuff which comes from a single discipline, because an interdisciplinary survey, because it combines information from a number of different disciplines, in order to have all those disciplines together, it has to make compromises about how much it can ask about each. For example, an economics only survey will have many more questions than the economic questions which are in share. And a medical only survey will have many more questions and will be much more detailed than a survey where the medical information has to share a limited time with information for 4 or 5 other disciplines. So, which means that you're getting, in terms of a pure academic, a single discipline survey, you get data which is not as good. I mean, it's not as detailed, and it will prove itself if it is to be combined with data from other disciplines. And there you have this problem of the silos. And the special issues, so the first, what we mentioned, general issues about interdisciplinary data and how it's used and how it's produced and how it pays off in the academic job market. However, there are specific problems with share, because the shared data is very complex, and once you can download the data, and it's something that it requires it requires an investment, put like this. I mean, I think a few months is necessary to really work with it. And this is unavoidable in an interview which can last, in cases, up to 5 hours. So it has a lot of information. It's very complex because there's a lot of missing values, because certain questions are answered by some people but not by others. So the data handling is very complex, and it acts for many people. This acts as an entry barrier. They just don't have the time or the effort or the capacity to deal with the complexity information there. And so in addition, there's a lot of documentation, metadata for quality control, supplementary data sets, etc. All this, when you first approach it, is quite daunting and requires sort of help to navigate. Things are slightly better recently because they've come up with the easy share database, which is a simplified version of share directed to graduate students. But even easy share is not a joke. I mean, it's not very simple. If you had to fully utilize share, you need to use the international comparability, which means to do what we talked about earlier. In order, what I mentioned is the Swedish type women in Greece versus Greek type women in Sweden. So you have to use the data as a whole, and you have to make full use of it. You have to try to think to not just put the information that that this one member of the sample is from Greece and the others from Egypt, and because if you do this, then all the things which are unique to Egypt will just be summarized in this term. But that, if you are to use it fully, in the way, say, that an American would use data from all 50 US states and not think about it. The ideal will be able to do the same thing with share, the 28 or however many countries there will be, and forgetting where they come from, and just say, you're saying, well, civil servant from, with 3 children with X illnesses, and you shouldn't mention that, the civil servant lives in Greece, Egypt, or where else. You should have the things that affect his decisions and those, rather than the characteristics. Anyway, that is to, before you get to that stage, requires a lot of work. Finally, the full utilization to use the panel data structure of the data increases the complexity in terms of introduces statistical methodology, which is not and that the complexity of the data creates a problem between policymakers who want simple messages, which are sort of digested simple messages, and academics who are taking on the complexity and really need the complexity in order to be able to guarantee that they have publications of the appropriate standard. So, and also interdisciplinary data needs, the problem is that the complexity of the structure means that there is the capacity to deal with the data and the statistical infrastructure. So the people capable to dealing with complex statistical model on the one hand, and on the other hand, the people who are generating the hypothesis would be in different departments. So you'd have, for example, medics who would posit a link between two falls and a type of occupation, for example. Medics need to come up with a hypothesis, which would then be tested by people capable and having the statistical tools to deal with this very complex data. Now, this is probably this issue that is one of the main reasons why take-up is lower. If you see the take-up of share is very high in places like the UK, Germany, the US, and rather low in places like the smaller EU countries, Greece, and certainly in Eastern Europe. The reason partly is this, that there is not the number of people capable of dealing with the statistical complexity which is created by that. So this the statistical complexity is one type of entry barrier which must be overcome. So, well, these are various items which come to my mind, trying to explain something which I thought was so promising, but the response has been sort of lower than expectations. So we're experimented with various things. So one, on the demand side, we're trying to sort of kickstart something on the interdisciplinary study of aging, an institute, for example, interdisciplinary study of aging, that could bring people together from different disciplines. And such, we have come up with a blueprint for it. The problem is we haven't got the money for it yet. But the point of such an institute is that it must be able to contribute to a national strategy on aging, which brings the various parts together, but also it should be able to interest public opinion on findings. And if you look at the survey from the national point of view, from the inside of the country, looking out, benchmarking with other countries. So, for example, is Greece good or bad? Because this kind of information comes up with some really unexpected facts all the time. For some reason, older Greeks are far less liable to fall and break bones and things than other individuals in Southern Europe and in the North. And consistently, you see this in all ways. This is something which is one. I saw this because I collaborated in a paper on falls with some doctors, and we were really surprised, and we couldn't explain it. And the point about such a survey is that it keeps bringing up things which people you can't explain, and very frequently it takes a lot of effort to try to make sense of. So that's on the demand side. Question is, you should, and in the case of surveys, I think it's a question of something like reverse Say's law. Demand creates its own supply. If there is a demand and curiosity to answer certain questions, the way will be found to find the data. But on the supply side, one can think of initiatives which would encourage people and familiarize people with using the data. So what we're trying to implement in my university is to have something like a share help desk. So there will be an individual who would be able to guide researchers from other fields, such as who may not be so familiar with statistical methodology, from medical fields or sociology, anthropology, etc., in the first steps to use the data. And of course, on the supply side, a key thing, because the sticking point about a survey such a share is the cost. And Holland, for example, the Netherlands, despite being in share from the very first time, was unable to fund the survey in wave 7 and wave 8. The reason was that the state funding that was given to other projects on the grounds, rather stupid grounds, that they had all those years were given money to share, and it's about time somebody else got some money. And the problem with that is that it disturbs the value add of share is its panel data. And once you break the panel nature, you are causing a wider problem for all countries participating, not just the country that stops participating. So during the pandemic, necessarily they had to supplement data, the CAPI, the data on the usual waves, with a special telephone interview, computer-assisted telephone interview on the pandemic and the lockdown, etc., and which is an example of mixed mode surveying. So this personal interviews combined with mixed mode. Now, in the future, and as internet use spreads, it might be possible to go in the direction, for example, of the web-based, which would make it much cheaper and also much more flexible. So, I mean, this is an idea of what happens to Greece. So you are now in the position that we were in 2004. I mean, the stories that Vicky told you. So, the planet longevity, the map is out there, and there's a big empty blob where Egypt is, and it's your job to try to fill this white blob in. So the way that what I know of Egypt, I would welcome it as a valuable extension to what we know about aging, because you can look at longevity in a country which is relatively still young and is still experiencing a demographic dividend. And the rural-urban links and the differences, this differentiation is something that would be the case in Egypt, and would also characterize a lot of other countries, and also other sorts of heterogeneity, because a survey, this is its key point, is to catalog all the cases where people are not close to the average. Similarly, capturing what happens within the family, the generational solidarity. Egypt, as in Greece, is essentially has a welfare state which relies on the family. The formal welfare state is rather limited, and the real social services are provided within the family, both as part of cohabitation, but also through exchanges with members of the family who may live in another town or may live elsewhere. And similarly, what I mentioned, the gaps in knowledge which exist because we rely solely on administrative data, I would guess would also be an issue in Egypt, because if you rely on administrative data, things such as linking health and productivity would come in different types of data. There will be no link. Then the second, which is that the survey is feasible in a country like Egypt, and with the makeup of Egypt. So that is wider importance to pinpoint and to overcome the technical obstacles. Some of the technical obstacles we already mentioned, such as how to ask for income. Others you will find as you go along, and many issues, as we saw, that we encounter in the south of Egypt, south of Europe, are also likely to be met in Egypt. This question, the rural-urban, the structure of the family, are common. And then, of course, it was a challenge to conduct it safely during the pandemic. And finally, collecting the data, it would be important to justify your work from the outside. The type of data that will be produced, you'll be able to demonstrate how useful it would be, in what type of things you can do with this data, what kind of questions you can answer which could not be answered before, or answers which are given now and can be corrected already. If you have a large pilot, you'll be able to get a feel of the kind of things that await you, and this will the type of things you will find could contribute to health policy, social policy, economics, maybe. So this is all I have to say. In terms of any questions, you have your work ahead of you, and I wish you. I mean, you're at a very exciting phase in the work, and I wish you every success.
Thank you, Platon.
Thanks.
Thank you for this fruitful presentation, information, and experience. Do you have any questions, my colleagues?
I have actually a comment and a question.
Yeah.
One of them, when you said that fall and fractures are less in Greece, compared to Scandinavia. This is, there was a cause for it. You are in your culture and your weather, you are more exposed to the sun. You have a better, culture that you are living outside the houses, exposed, so you have less osteoporosis. So we expect, especially in your culture, that falls and fractures, especially in older age, will be less.
No, but
Yeah.
it was low compared to Spain and Italy as well.
Yeah, but you expect the same in South, in the south of
But Spain and Italy were very high and Greece were very low.
yeah, in Greece, that is expected. So it's just this is one. The other one, did they try to get part of the questionnaire, which is so long, for at least for some population, as a self-administered questionnaire? Just divide like this sort of mixed way. Yeah, you can do that maybe for the beginning, or you can do it for the follow-up. This could be one of the ways to make the questionnaire less lengthy, because very long time that it will take. This could be one of the ways, especially if you have an educated population, at least subpopulation, we can even try it. I wonder if they tried it in some countries or not.
Web-based questionnaires on parts of the questionnaire is something that I have experimented in the United States. They have used out of necessity in Holland, because they didn't have funding to have a CAPI-based interview. They tried as an experiment to see what would happen in a web-based questionnaire. So what they did is they actually supplied the sample with laptops. So there's specialized laptops which are already the programs were already on the laptops, and they used that laptop to communicate. It worked reasonably well in Holland, but in places like Greece, the computer literacy is very low. Admittedly, it's becoming, as a part of the pandemic, etc., computer literacy has risen and access of older people has improved, mainly through their grandchildren, incidentally. I mean, because it's the grandchildren who set up the laptop or the tablet or whatever and get the grandparents to talk. What Share does have, but it's rather limited uses. They leave a drop-off questionnaire, so there will be they leave a paper-based questionnaire, which is decided by the country teams. So the paper-based questionnaire in Greece, the drop-off questionnaire, is different from the one, say, in Italy or Portugal or whatever. But the number of questions that you can ask in that is no more than 10 or 20. And because it's the same questionnaire which is left for everyone, the possibility of actually zeroing in on a specific issue is essentially zero. But the thing about Share, and the thing about Share as a science-driven initiative is that there is a constant readiness to experiment, and to experiment with different ways of collecting data, with different types of data, with different survey modes, etc., etc. So my answer now refers to the situation as it is today, but what you mentioned is a need which has been flagged, and I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 2 or 3 waves they would start having sort of separate web-based questionnaires, such as the one you suggested.
Yeah, I'm just saying so because even during the pandemic, there was actually the real change in Egypt as regards using the tablets, using the email. Most of the communications with the government became either through computers or others. Our students, especially in high school, they are all using the tablets. They gave them at school.
Right.
So that's why I'm asking. So I mean, there is change of behavior, change of culture. There's a lot of other things that may help such work, especially if you are thinking about follow-up. Because I mean, I did a lot of, some work in that using for example, the mobile helped me a lot, even to ask through the mobile, especially for the follow-up, because we had some studied that we needed to follow up after a while. The mobile helped me a lot really to get some information. The other part that now we are thinking, many of, especially of our students and young people, they are using very easily, the tablet, even much better than my generation. So that's why I'm
Absolutely.
thinking this could be one of the ways even to do part of questionnaire or at least the follow-up later on. I mean, it's just an ideas because I think
I think you're
more
right.
innovative in that. Yeah.
It's I think eventually share will move in the direction you mentioned. The problem at the moment it's like one of these huge tankers that it's so big and it's got such momentum that in order to turn you have to shift the steering wheel, and then the ship would turn left in 20 or 30 miles away, because decisions take a long time to be discussed and decided, etc. So it's an organization, because they're all the separate member states, and the way that the decisions are made and financed, etc. So at the moment, the way that the wave that will take place in 2022 is essentially closed. It cannot be affected at all. Not even, you can't even change one question, and there will be a possibility of affecting the wave in 2023. But out of necessity, I mean, the pandemic does have this effect of giving new opportunities. As you mentioned, people are much more computer literate, but also creates necessities for rapid decisions. One example is the decision, rather than just to give up on when the lockdown stopped, the 8th wave, is to complement this with a telephone interview on COVID. So the first wave of that was conducted in 2020. Is already released at the moment. They're processing they finished the data collection for the second wave of CATI, which will cover all the experiences since the summer of 2020. So it will cover the second and third wave and the Delta variant, etc. And it will have much richer information, because the problem in most countries in the first COVID CATI, in Greece, for example, there was hardly anyone. Greece managed to escape the first wave of the pandemic very well. I mean, sort of very few people of the sample who were affected, or even new people who had been directly affected by COVID. So the first wave is primarily used for the effects of the indirect effects on healthcare, COVID, through lockdowns, the effect of lockdown, the financial effects of lockdowns, and the postponement of medical procedures, etc. The second wave, my guess is that will, because the pandemic has spread much more, will show much more direct impact. But it would be my wish. The problem with a survey like SHARE is that it's like a convoy of ships. It has to go as fast as the slowest ship on the line. So countries like the Netherlands or maybe Scandinavia can already move in the direction of having specialized surveys, but countries like Bulgaria and Romania would presumably be far more behind. So, but these things are currently being discussed, and I would not be surprised if by 2023 there haven't been major changes, because being able to have a web-based questionnaire provides much more information, but also reduces the cost of information considerably, and that's a really major consideration, especially in the northern countries. The northern countries, the cost of sending an interviewer to conduct a personal survey is very high. In places like this, the cost per hour of interviewer is not very high, but the necessity to send interviewers throughout the country in winter, for example, they have to go to islands in winter to interview a single person, and if the weather, if there's high wind, they might be stuck in that island for 2 or 3 days and not being able to come back. So it's just the joys of in an international survey.
Thank you very much, Platon.
Thank you.
And let us welcome Dr. May Khorshid. She will start at 2:30, but I see her now.
Yes, hi.
Thanks, May, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. You can start anytime, yani, we are ready.
I'm sorry, May, I took up your time.
No worries at all. Actually,
No, it's time.
yeah, we're starting at 2:30. I just thought I'd come in and see if there's any technical problems, seeing as there's always a technical problem, right?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right.
Thanks very much.
I hope that if there are future workshops, I'll be able to attend in person, because I would really like that. Anyway, I'll leave you to the capable hands of May, and many thanks once more.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. I'll send you the presentation of Vicky. You have mine, but I'll send you hers.
Yeah.